And now joining us on Booktv is Professor Joseph Glatthaar, University of North Carolina. Professor Glatthaar, what do you teach here at the university?
I teach American military history, U.S. history, and seminars in the Civil War.
You've written several books on the Civil War as well. How'd you get interested in that topic?
When I was a little kid, my brother got the American Heritage volume for Christmas, and I just loved it. So that's probably how I learned to read, trying to read that book. And I love the pictures, the maps, and so on, and that really hooked me on the Civil War.
You don't sound like you grew up in the South, though.
No, I grew up in New York.
What got you fascinated in the Confederacy?
I've always had an interest in both sides in the Civil War. My early books were all on the Union. I wrote a book on Sherman's Army, and I wrote a book on black soldiers and their white officers in the Civil War called Forged in Battle. I wrote a book on Partners in Command, which was about command relationships among Civil War leaders, and there I went into the Confederacy. And because I studied Davis and Johnston's relationship and Lee and Jackson's relationship, things like that. So it was a nice, easy transition over to Lee's Army.
So before we get into your most recent book, which is Soldiering in the Army of Northern Virginia, a statistical portrait of the troops who served under Robert E. Lee, Professor, how about some macro figures? How many people died in the Civil War? How many soldiers served in the Civil War on both sides?
The Union, about 2.25 million people served. The Confederacy, probably around 900,000, but we don't have an exact tabulation. Recent studies have suggested that more people died in the Civil War, but the statistics are based on census records, and it's a really dicey thing to rely on that kind of evidence. So the best evidence indicates that Virginia and North Carolina had fewer fatalities than we had anticipated. South Carolina is doing an in-depth study on its state, and thus far the evidence indicates the same thing, about 10% fewer fatalities than we had thought. With regard to the Union keeps exceedingly good records. And of course, there was no destruction of Union records, so the Union tabulation of about 360,000 dead is probably right in the ballpark. The biggest statistic that we have not been able to determine are the numbers of African Americans who died during the war who were not in uniform. At these contraband camps, we're talking about perhaps hundreds of thousands who died. It's really, there's an in-depth project by a friend of mine, Tavolia Glimf, over at Duke, and she's hopefully going to try and track down the statistics for us.
So 360,000 deaths on the Union side?
Yes.
Confederate side right now, the general figure?
Probably, we used to assume it was about 260,000 or something like that, so it's probably around 220,000 Confederate dead.
Professor Glatthaar, your most recent book is about the Army of Northern Virginia. What is this army?
The Army of Northern Virginia is Robert E. Lee's army, and it was Lee who really, he didn't invent the name, but he became the person who made the name famous. A few people had referred to it as the Army of Northern Virginia prior to Lee, but Lee began issuing orders stating the Army of Northern Virginia, and so it became synonymous with Robert E. Lee and his soldiers.
How large? What campaigns?
The Army of Northern Virginia fought in the Eastern Theater, and so we don't know precisely how many people served because units come and units go, but I would estimate about 200,000 Confederate soldiers at any given time during the course of the war were members of that army. At peak, it was probably about 90,000 men, which was in June of 1862. And then, of course, it dwindled down to nothingness at the end of the war. So it's a pretty substantial army, and it fought many of the largest battles in the war. Of course, Gettysburg, which was the largest battle of the war, the 7 Days battles, a handful of fights taking place over the course of 7 days that had a total of 36,000 casualties on both sides. And Spotsylvania is huge, Wilderness is huge, Chancellorsville is huge, Second Manassas is huge. Those are huge, enormous battles. Antietam, of course, which is the single bloodiest day of the Civil War.
Those are all Northern Virginia armies. What other armies were there on the Confederate side?
The other principal army for the Confederacy is the Army of Tennessee. There was also an Army of Mississippi, and those are really the principal armies for the Confederacy.
What do we know about the Army of Northern Virginia? What was its makeup?
Soldiers came from every Confederate state in the Army of Northern Virginia, regiments from each of those states. The soldiers, half of them enlisted or entered the Army, well, they had to enlist in 1861. Another 30% entered in 1862. Most of them entered before the Confederate conscription law went into effect. So these are largely volunteers. About 37% of them were married. The original enlistees, 1861, are overwhelmingly single, but then 1862, they begin digging deeper into the barrel, and so you get a lot more married soldiers who go in. They are pretty wealthy as far as soldiers are concerned, as well as compared to Southerners in general. A really high percentage are from either slaveholders or their families own slaves, and they live with their families. So about 38% are in that situation. 44% of them live in slaveholding households. So slavery is a really powerful force with regard to these individuals. They have, they're quite wealthy. The median income is well above what we would consider middle class. It's solidly middle class, but it's on the upper end of the middle class. So they're pretty wealthy, well-to-do. Most of them, a majority of them are farmers. A fair number of professionals, some white-collar folks, and surprisingly, not nearly as many skilled workers as I would have anticipated.
Why?
I think because the war demanded the skills in the civilian world. That is, somebody's got to manufacture these things that the Confederate armies need, and as a result, the government was encouraging many of the skilled workers to stay at home, and they were oftentimes exempted from conscription.
So can we extrapolate from what you just said that when this army was first formed, it was an enthusiastic group of volunteers fighting for a way of life?
Absolutely. They were fighting for a way of life. They were fighting for the institution of slavery. They were fighting to protect what they had, their property, and their way of life, in the sense that they had aspirations to own slaves if they didn't own slaves. Even poor soldiers who enlisted oftentimes saw benefits in service. First of all, you get a steady paycheck. Secondly, many of them did not anticipate the war would go on as long as it did, and that the losses would be so severe. And thirdly, they had hopes that in the post-war years, their friends in the Army would throw business their way or would hire them. And it makes good sense. If I were in the Army and we got out and I knew you were really a good soldier and I needed somebody with your skills, I'm going to hire my old Army buddy because I can trust you. You're responsible. I know what you can do. And so, and in many regards, we depended on one another for survival. So it was a very sensible approach by a lot of the poorer people to join the Army as well.
Professor Glatthaar, when you look at the statistics, can you see where the level of enthusiasm goes down through desertions, et cetera?
Yes, it's a very, it's kind of bumpy up and down depending on the time period, how successful the war is going, and what's going on with regard to the personal lives of the soldiers. So for example, in Lee's Army, the soldiers who are from the Deep South almost never desert until Longstreet's 2 divisions got sent to Georgia. Why? Because they're not going to be able to make it home from Virginia. And so it doesn't make sense for them to try. Whereas desertions for Virginians, North Carolinians, and so on are pretty high in Lee's Army because they can get home. They have a fair chance of making it. And so those are big factors, but especially in the late stages of the war. You can't separate Lincoln's re-election from Sherman's march. But what you see is a huge, because they happen almost simultaneously, but you see a huge increase in desertion in Lee's Army the last quarter of 1864 and the first